May 26, 1941, Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans, Louisiana. The morning sun glinted off the calm water as Commander Ross Daggett from the Navy Bureau of Ships stood on the shore, arms crossed, watching a peculiar flat-bottomed boat roar toward the beach. Beside him, Major Ernest Linsert of the Marine Corps Equipment Board checked his stopwatch. They had come to witness what many in Washington called an impossibility. Andrew Jackson Higgins, the stubborn Nebraska-born boat builder with a reputation for crude language and even cruder defiance of authority, had promised them something the United States military desperately needed but couldn't build. A boat with a ramp at the front. A boat that could charge straight at a hostile shore, drop that ramp in seconds, and discharge 36 fully equipped combat troops directly onto the beach while under enemy fire. The boat's bow struck sand. The ramp dropped with a metallic clang. Soldiers poured out in a disciplined rush and sprinted up the beach. The entire operation took less than 30 seconds. Then the boat reversed, its protected propeller churning in just 3 feet of water, spun around without broaching, and headed back out to reload. Commander Daggett and Major Linsert exchanged glances. In that moment, though neither man could have known it, they had just witnessed the solution to a problem that would determine the outcome of the greatest war in human history. This simple modification would transform amphibious warfare forever. It would make possible the liberation of Europe, the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, and the very strategy that would bring Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan to their knees. Without this innovation, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, could never have happened. The Allied strategy of landing armies anywhere along vast coastlines rather than only at heavily defended ports would have remained an impossible dream. The story began not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, where an unconventional entrepreneur solved a problem for loggers and oil drillers that would later save the free world. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born in Columbus, Nebraska, in 1886. His father, a lawyer and judge originally from Chicago, served as a newspaper publisher with connections at the highest levels of American politics. When Andrew was only 7 years old, his father died from injuries sustained in a fall, plunging the family into financial hardship. His mother, descended from Irish immigrants who had fled after the failed rebellion of 1848, instilled in her son a fierce determination and independence that would define his entire life. By age 9, the young Higgins had already demonstrated the entrepreneurial genius that would later change history. He started with a single sickle, cutting grass for neighbors. Soon he purchased a lawnmower, then another, and another, until he had 17 mowers and was hiring older boys to do the actual cutting while he managed the business. His mother moved the family to Omaha, where Higgins attended Creighton Prep School. But his fierce independence and quick temper led to repeated conflicts with authority. After a brawling incident in his junior year, the school expelled him. Rather than seeing this as failure, Higgins joined the Nebraska Army National Guard, serving first in the infantry and later with the engineers. During military maneuvers on the Platte River, he first encountered boats and the challenge of moving troops across water. He proved so capable that he achieved the rank of first lieutenant, a remarkable accomplishment for someone with incomplete formal education. After leaving the National Guard in 1906, the 20-year-old Higgins moved south to Mobile, Alabama, seeking opportunity in the booming lumber industry. For 4 years, he worked various jobs in lumber, shipping, and boat building, absorbing everything he could about maritime commerce and vessel construction. In 1910, he moved to New Orleans to manage a German-owned lumber importing firm. The port city, with its access to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, suited his ambitions perfectly. By 1922, Higgins had learned enough to strike out on his own. He founded the Higgins Lumber and Export Company, importing hardwood from the Philippines, Central America, and Africa, while exporting southern pine and bald cypress. To support this business, he acquired a fleet of sailing ships, reportedly the largest under American registry at that time. He established his own shipyard to build and repair these vessels, along with the tugs and barges needed to move timber through Louisiana's complex waterways. But the real innovation came from necessity. In 1926, Higgins faced a persistent problem that plagued the Louisiana timber and oil industries. The shallow, debris-choked bayous, and marshes held valuable resources, but conventional boats couldn't reach them. Boats with exposed propellers fouled constantly on submerged logs, stumps, and vegetation. They couldn't operate in less than 6 feet of water. They couldn't run up onto muddy banks to load cargo without getting stuck. Higgins decided to solve this problem himself. He enrolled in a correspondence course in naval architecture from the National University of Sciences in Chicago, an unaccredited institution but one that provided solid technical training. Applying this new knowledge to his practical experience, Higgins designed a revolutionary craft. The key innovation was a semi-tunnel built into the hull that protected the propeller, recessing it so obstacles would slide past rather than foul the blades. He added a distinctive spoonbill bow that enabled the boat to drive straight onto riverbanks, load cargo, and then reverse off without damage. The boat could operate in just 18 inches of water, turn, practically in its own length, and achieve surprising speed in shallow channels. Higgins called his creation the Eureka boat, a name that captured his enthusiasm for solving what others considered an insoluble problem. The Eureka became invaluable to oil companies exploring the Gulf Coast marshlands and trappers working the Louisiana wetlands. Word spread quickly. Orders came from around the world. Customers purchased Eureka boats for use in the Persian Gulf, the Amazon River basin, and throughout Asia. The boats set speed records on runs from New Orleans to St. Louis in 1930 and 1931, demonstrating both their efficiency and reliability. Higgins had achieved success as both an innovator and a businessman. Then the Great Depression struck. The lumber export business that had financed his innovations collapsed. Declining world trade, fierce competition from tramp steamers willing to work for minimal profit, and shrinking demand combined to destroy the Higgins Lumber and Export Company. By 1930, the company had failed completely. Higgins was forced to close most operations and sell off assets. Yet with characteristic stubbornness, he refused to quit. He maintained his small boatyard on St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans, producing motorboats, tugs, and barges for private customers and the United States Coast Guard. In 1932, he renamed the operation Higgins Industries. His workforce numbered just 75 employees. The company seemed destined to remain a minor player in a competitive market, one setback away from final collapse. Then the Marines came looking. Throughout the 1930s, the United States Marine Corps had been wrestling with a fundamental problem of modern warfare. How do you get troops from ships onto a defended beach? The challenge wasn't just theoretical. Military strategists understood that any future war would require amphibious operations, but the Navy's Bureau of 12, Construction and Repair had repeatedly tried and failed to produce an adequate landing craft. Their designs were slow, awkward, and suffered from a crippling flaw. Troops had to climb over the sides to disembark. This exposed soldiers to devastating enemy fire during the most vulnerable moment of an amphibious assault. Men loaded down with combat equipment, weapons, and ammunition would have to clamber over the gunwales while under fire, then drop into chest-deep water and struggle towards shore. The casualty rates in any contested landing would be catastrophic. Unknown to most Americans, the Japanese military had already solved this problem. During their invasion of China in the summer of 1937, Japanese forces used landing craft equipped with retractable bow ramps. Marine Lieutenant Victor Harold Krulak, a Naval Academy graduate stationed in Shanghai as an observer during the Second Sino-Japanese War, witnessed these operations. Using a telephoto lens, he took detailed photographs of the Japanese vessels. Krulak immediately recognized their revolutionary potential. Troops could charge straight out the front, protected by the ramp itself until the last possible moment. Loading and unloading would be exponentially faster. Officers could maintain better unit cohesion. The entire tactical equation of amphibious warfare would change. These boats represented a quantum leap in military capability. Krulak sent his photographs and detailed observations back to Washington, with an urgent recommendation that the United States military develop similar craft immediately. 2 years later, he discovered with frustration that the Navy had filed his report away with a dismissive notation calling it the work of some nut out in China. The military bureaucracy, comfortable with its own designs and suspicious of outside ideas, had ignored potentially war-winning intelligence. Officers in the Bureau of Ships apparently saw no reason to adopt foreign innovations, or acknowledge that an outsider might understand amphibious operations better than they did, but Krulak refused to let the idea die. He built a balsa wood model of the Japanese design and began personally advocating for its adoption. Eventually, through a combination of persistence and the Marine Corps' growing frustration with Navy-designed boats, Krulak's message found receptive ears. Meanwhile, the Marine Corps had independently begun testing civilian boat designs, desperate to find something better than what the Navy offered. In 1938, they invited boat manufacturers to submit designs for trials. Higgins wasn't officially notified of the competition, but when he learned about it through industry contacts, he showed up anyway with his Eureka boat. His reputation for ignoring protocol and forcing his way into opportunities was already well established. The testing took place in February 1939 during fleet landing exercises. Higgins' Eureka boat demolished the competition. It was faster, more maneuverable, and could operate in far shallower water than any Navy-designed craft. The shallow draft and protected propeller were exactly what the Marines needed for approaching defended beaches. The Marines were impressed enough to designate it the Landing Craft Personnel Large, or LCP-L, and authorize limited production. But the fundamental problem remained. Troops still had to clamber over the sides. In combat conditions, this would still result in unacceptable casualties. The boat solved the approach problem, but not the debarkation problem. When Marine Corps representatives showed Higgins photographs of the Japanese ramp-bowed landing craft in late 1940, he immediately grasped the solution. The conversation reportedly lasted only minutes. Higgins called his chief engineer by telephone, described the Japanese ramp design in detail, and gave an order that would become legendary in his company. Build a mock-up. Have it ready for my inspection when I return to New Orleans. Within 1 month, in early 1941, Higgins had a working prototype. The boat underwent successful tests in Lake Pontchartrain. The ramp design worked flawlessly, dropping in seconds and providing a stable platform for troops to rush directly onto the beach. On May 26, 1941, Commander Daggett and Major Linzert witnessed the tests that opened this story. The demonstration exceeded all expectations. The Marines and Navy immediately recognized they had found their solution. Higgins had created the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, the LCVP. History would simply call it the Higgins boat. The boat's specifications seemed modest on paper, but every detail reflected careful engineering. It measured 36 feet in length and just under 11 feet in the beam. It weighed 18,000 pounds empty. A 225 horsepower grey marine diesel engine powered the craft to a maximum speed of 12 knots in calm water, though in rough seas the speed dropped considerably and the flat bottom made for a brutally uncomfortable ride. The shallow draft allowed it to operate in just 3 feet of water at the stern and 2 feet 2 inches forward, shallow enough to approach most beaches without grounding on sandbars. The hull was constructed primarily of plywood, a decision that proved brilliant for multiple reasons. It saved critical steel for tanks, ships, and weapons. It reduced weight, which increased the boat's carrying capacity. It kept manufacturing costs manageable, and it allowed for rapid repairs even under field conditions. A skilled carpenter with basic tools could patch a damaged plywood hull far more easily than fixing steel. The crew consisted of 4 men. A coxswain operated the boat from an armoured position at the rear, protected by steel plating from small arms fire. A motor machinist maintained the engine and was responsible for keeping the craft running under the harshest conditions. 2 seamen manned the defensive armament, a pair of 30 caliber Browning machine guns mounted on either side of the coxswain's station. These weapons provided suppressing fire during the approach and could engage enemy positions on the beach. The boat's carrying capacity was remarkable for its size. It could transport either a 36-man platoon with full combat equipment, or a jeep and a 12-man squad, or 8,100 pounds of cargo. The steel bow ramp could be raised and lowered quickly by a simple mechanical system that rarely failed. Most importantly, the boat could beach itself, discharge its entire load in 30 to 60 seconds, reverse off the beach using its protected propeller, spin around without broaching in the surf, and be ready for another run within 3 to 4 minutes. This rapid turnaround time meant each boat could make multiple trips during an assault, multiplying the effectiveness of the landing fleet. The patent for the ramp design was filed on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into World War II. The timing was both symbolic and practical. Higgins wanted to ensure his revolutionary design received legal protection, but he also understood that the nation now faced an existential crisis that would require every boat he could build. Patent number 2341866 was issued on February 15, 1944, just months before the Normandy invasion. By then, thousands of LCVPs were already in service around the world. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Andrew Higgins and his small boatyard were suddenly thrust into the center of the largest industrial mobilization in human history. The challenge was staggering. The military needed thousands of landing craft immediately, not years in the future. Traditional shipyards, accustomed to building vessels one at a time over months or years, couldn't possibly meet the demand. The entire concept of amphibious warfare, and therefore the entire Allied strategy for fighting Japan in the Pacific and returning to Europe, depended on solving this production problem. Higgins responded with characteristic audacity and innovation. He expanded from his single warehouse behind the St. Charles Avenue showroom into 8 separate manufacturing plants scattered across New Orleans. City Block Street, a major thoroughfare, was transformed into a boat assembly line. He purchased the massive City Park factory complex. He took over warehouses, converted office buildings, and requisitioned any space that could accommodate boat construction. More revolutionary than the physical expansion was Higgins' implementation of assembly line techniques that transformed boat construction from a craft into an industrial process. Before Higgins, boats were built one at a time by skilled workers who performed every step. Higgins broke the construction process into discrete stages, with components manufactured in different locations and brought together for final assembly. Frames were built in one facility, engines installed in another, hulls assembled in a third, and final fitting out completed at a fourth location. This modular approach allowed for unprecedented production speed and made it possible to train workers quickly on specific tasks rather than requiring years of apprenticeship. Higgins also pioneered integrated workforce practices that were radical for 1940s America and especially for the Deep South. His plants employed whites and African Americans working side by side at equal pay for equal work. He hired women for skilled positions previously reserved exclusively for men, putting them to work as welders, electricians, and machine operators. He gave jobs to elderly workers and people with disabilities whom other employers rejected as unemployable. His only criterion was whether someone could do the work. This wasn't idealism or progressive politics. It was practical necessity combined with Higgins' fundamental belief that talent and determination mattered more than demographics. He needed workers desperately, and he wasn't going to let social prejudices prevent him from using every available person. The workforce responded with fierce loyalty and extraordinary productivity. Employment at Higgins Industries exploded from 75 workers in 1938 to over 20,000 by 1943, making it the largest employer in the New Orleans area and one of the largest boat builders in the world. At peak production in 1944, Higgins Industries was manufacturing an average of 700 vessels per month. The operation ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Overhead, banners in the factories read, "The guy who relaxes is helping the Axis." Workers understood with visceral clarity that every boat they built would save American lives. Every rivet they drove, every weld they completed, every coat of paint they applied brought victory closer and brought their sons, brothers, and husbands home sooner. The workforce itself represented a cross-section of American society thrown together by wartime necessity. Young women barely out of high school operated welding torches alongside elderly men who had built wooden boats before anyone dreamed of assembly lines. African American workers who had been barred from skilled positions in most southern industries found themselves training white workers on specialized techniques. People with physical disabilities who had been told they were unemployable discovered they could perform critical manufacturing tasks that didn't require perfect mobility. This mixing of backgrounds, races, and abilities created tensions at first. New Orleans in the 1940s was a deeply segregated society where rigid social hierarchies governed every interaction, but Higgins himself set the tone. He had no patience for prejudice when it interfered with production. Workers who couldn't cooperate were fired immediately, regardless of their race or background. Those who proved their competence were rewarded with raises and promotions based purely on merit. The working conditions were demanding. Summer heat in New Orleans could be brutal, and the factories had minimal ventilation. Workers labored amid the smell of paint, diesel fuel, and sawdust. The noise was constant and deafening. Power tools screamed. Hammers rang against metal. Diesel engines roared during testing. Workers often went home exhausted, covered in paint and grease, their ears ringing, but they took fierce pride in their work. Each boat bore a small brass plate with its identification number and the Higgins Industries name. Workers would sometimes write messages on hidden interior surfaces, words of encouragement for the troops who would ride these boats into combat. "Good luck, boys. Come home safe. Give." The military could count on every Higgins boat to perform exactly as specified, and this reliability became legendary among the troops who depended on these craft. The production statistics defy easy comprehension. During the war, Higgins Industries and other companies licensed to use Higgins designs produced more than 23,398 LCVPs. This represented roughly 93% of all landing craft used in the war. The company also manufactured other craft, including the larger landing craft mechanized that could carry Sherman tanks, PT boats that hunted enemy ships in high-speed night attacks, supply vessels, river patrol boats, and various specialized equipment ranging from torpedo tubes to gun turrets and smoke generators. Higgins' total wartime output reached 20,094 boats of all types. By September 1943, 12,964 of the American Navy's 14,072 vessels had been designed by Higgins Industries. Put simply, 92% of the United States Navy was a Higgins Navy. The company received the Army-Navy E Award for excellence multiple times, the highest honor the armed forces could bestow on a civilian enterprise. The E stood for excellence in production, and earning it once was considered a major achievement. Higgins Industries won it so many times that the awards became routine. One particular story captures Higgins' approach to impossible deadlines and his relationship with military bureaucracy. In April 1941, several weeks before the LCVP trials, Higgins visited Washington and saw Bureau of Ships plans for a tank lighter, a large ramped landing craft capable of landing a 30-ton Sherman tank. When he returned to New Orleans, he told his engineering department to design their own version. Several iterations followed over the next weeks. Then, in late May, Higgins received notice that a board of Navy and Marine Corps representatives would visit New Orleans in 3 days to examine his ramped bow landing craft and review initial designs for a tank lighter. Most manufacturers would have presented drawings and promised delivery in months. Higgins informed the board that instead of plans, he would have a working craft ready for their inspection. The Navy replied that it couldn't be done. 3 days wasn't enough time to design and build a functional boat capable of carrying 30 tons. Higgins' response became part of company legend and perfectly captured his personality. The hell it can't. You just be here in 3 days. His team went to work with fevered intensity. They pulled an existing towboat hull into Felicity Street, a side street near the factory, and blocked off the entire street to passing traffic. Builders began cutting down the hull, removing the superstructure and reconfiguring the interior, while Higgins locked his engineering team in an office with explicit orders they couldn't leave until they had solved the ramp problem. The ramp design for the LCVP wouldn't scale up to handle a tank's weight and the stresses of repeated use with heavy vehicles. Within 12 hours, the engineering team had developed a solution using heavier materials and reinforced bracing. When the board arrived exactly 3 days later, a 45-foot tank lighter sat ready for inspection on Felicity Street. The vessel, designated the landing craft mechanized, had been designed and constructed in 61 hours. The board members were stunned. They tested the boat immediately in Lake Pontchartrain, loading it with a jeep and then with successively heavier vehicles. The craft performed perfectly. The board placed an order for 50 units on the spot. The story spread through military circles and reinforced Higgins' reputation as a man who delivered the impossible on schedule and wasn't intimidated by naval officers or bureaucratic procedures. The impact of the Higgins boat on Allied strategy cannot be overstated. Before the LCVP, amphibious invasions required the capture of ports with their docks, cranes, and unloading facilities. Ports were heavily fortified, well-defended strongpoints that could be held by relatively small forces. Any invasion force would have to concentrate its attack on these choke points, allowing defenders to mass their firepower. The Higgins boat changed everything. With thousands of landing craft available, Allied commanders could land entire armies on any stretch of beach. Defenders suddenly had to spread their forces across hundreds of miles of coastline, never knowing where the blow would fall. As one Marine Corps historian later observed, the Higgins boats broke the gridlock on the ship-to-shore movement. It is impossible to overstate the tactical advantages this craft gave United States amphibious commanders in World War II. The boats made their combat debut in August 1942 during the Guadalcanal landings in the Jaitin-Dates, Solomon Islands, the first major American offensive operation in the Pacific. Over 11,000 Marines landed from Higgins boats, establishing a beachhead that began the long march across the Pacific. Later that same year, Operation Torch used them for the invasion of North Africa. American forces landed at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, bringing the war to the European theatre. The Higgins boats proved their worth at Sicily in July 1943, when over 150,000 Allied troops stormed ashore. At Salerno in September 1943 and Anzio in January 1944, American forces used Higgins boats to establish beachheads in Italy, beginning the liberation of that country. Throughout the Pacific, the boats became synonymous with American amphibious power. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines faced their bloodiest assault yet, with over 1,000 killed in 76 hours of fighting. The Higgins boats delivered them into that hell and evacuated the wounded. At Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the same scene repeated. Higgins boats approached defended beaches, ramps dropped, and American troops charged forward. The British acquired their own fleet of Higgins boats, using them for commando raids along the French coast in preparation for the main invasion of Europe. But the supreme test came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, Operation Overlord. The largest amphibious invasion in military history. The statistics of that day remain staggering. An armada of over 7,000 naval vessels, including approximately 4,000 landing craft and 1,200 warships, crossed the English Channel toward the coast of Nazi-occupied Normandy. In the pre-dawn hours, 23,400 airborne troops parachuted behind enemy lines to secure the flanks and block German reinforcements. At 6:30 in the morning, the first waves of amphibious assault troops began, landing on 5 beaches, code-named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. By day's end, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had come ashore in Normandy. Of the landing craft that delivered these forces, an estimated 1,500 were Higgins boats. They carried the troops who waded through waist-deep water under withering German fire on Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of the 5 landing zones. They delivered the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division, who scaled the bluffs under machine gun and artillery fire, suffering over 2,000 casualties but ultimately breaking through German defences. They brought the Rangers who scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc to destroy German artillery positions. They landed the Canadians at Juno Beach, who fought their way inland against fierce resistance. They delivered the British forces at Gold and Sword, who pushed towards Seine. At Utah Beach, where American forces faced lighter opposition due to effective preliminary bombardment and fortuitous landing in a less defended sector, the Higgins boats discharged over 23,000 troops with relatively few casualties. One coxswain of a Higgins boat, signalman 3rd Class James R. Ward, later described his experience at Omaha Beach. "We made our run to the beach at dawn. The water was rough and men were getting seasick. Then the German artillery opened up. We could see shells hitting the water around us. Other boats were hit and sinking. We kept going. When we hit the beach, I dropped the ramp. The men charged out, and I could see them getting hit. Some fell in the water. Some made it to the sand. Then we had to back off and go get another load. We made 5 trips that day. Each time was worse than the last. The beach was covered with bodies and burning vehicles, but we kept bringing more men in. That's what we were there to do. The experience varied dramatically across the 5 beaches. At Utah Beach, where the 4th Infantry Division landed, strong currents pushed the assault boats about 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zone. This accident proved fortunate. The area where they actually landed was less heavily defended than their original target. The Higgins boats discharged troops who quickly overwhelmed German defenders and pushed inland with relatively light casualties. Over 23,000 troops landed at Utah on D-Day with fewer than 200 casualties, a remarkably low figure for an amphibious assault. At Omaha Beach, the situation was catastrophic. German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division occupied high ground overlooking the beach with excellent fields of fire. Many of the specialized tanks and artillery pieces meant to support the infantry had been lost when their landing craft sank in rough seas. The aerial bombardment that was supposed to neutralize German positions had missed its targets due to cloud cover. When the first waves of Higgins boats approached, they entered a killing zone. German machine guns and artillery had overlapping fields of fire covering every yard of beach. The ramps dropped and men charged out directly into this fire. Many were hit before they reached the waterline. Others drowned when they stepped into deep water weighed down by equipment. Some boats took direct hits from artillery, killing everyone aboard. The coxswains and crews of the Higgins boats showed extraordinary courage that morning. They had to drive their boats straight toward the beach while under fire, unable to take evasive action. Once the ramp dropped, they had to hold position while troops disembarked, making them stationary targets. Then they had to reverse off the beach, all while German guns targeted them specifically because disabled boats would block follow-up waves. Some coxswains made a dozen trips that day, each time steeling themselves for another run through the fire. By mid-morning, Omaha Beach was littered with destroyed and burning Higgins boats. But more kept coming, wave after wave, bringing the reinforcements and ammunition that eventually enabled American forces to break through German defenses and secure the beach by nightfall. The British and Canadian beaches saw similar patterns of intense fighting, though none quite matched the horror of Omaha. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced rough seas that delayed their landing and gave German defenders more time to recover from the preliminary bombardment. The Higgins boats, carrying the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, struggled through choppy water, many troops violently seasick by the time they reached shore. When the ramps dropped, they charged out onto a beach still heavily defended by German forces. The fighting was fierce and casualties high, but by the end of D-Day, Canadian forces had penetrated deeper into France than any other Allied formation, reaching nearly 7 miles inland. Without the Higgins boat, the Normandy invasion simply could not have occurred as planned. Allied forces would have been forced to attempt a frontal assault on a major port like Cherbourg or Le Havre, which would have been far more heavily defended and would have resulted in catastrophic casualties and probable failure. The flexible approach enabled by having thousands of landing craft meant the Allies could strike across a 50-mile front, overwhelming German defences through sheer scale rather than concentrating on a single point. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, understood this with perfect clarity. Years later, when historian Stephen Ambrose interviewed him in 1964 for a biography, Eisenhower stated without hesitation, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach." The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Adolf Hitler, from the opposite perspective, reached the same conclusion. After D-Day, as German forces reeled from the scale of the invasion and the impossibility of defending the entire Atlantic Wall, the German dictator bitterly referred to Higgins as the new Noah, building an ark that would doom the Third Reich. The biblical reference was apartment where the ancient Noah had saved the animals, This modern Noah saved civilization itself from totalitarian darkness. The contribution extended beyond Europe. In the Pacific Theater, General Douglas MacArthur used Higgins boats for his island-hopping campaign that brought American forces ever closer to Japan. The famous photograph of MacArthur wading ashore in the Philippines in October 1944 shows him stepping from a Higgins boat, fulfilling his promise to return. That iconic image of American determination and the liberation of the Philippines was made possible by a Louisiana boat builder who had learned his craft solving problems in the bayous. In March 1945, Higgins boats even crossed the Rhine River into Germany itself, bringing the war to the heart of the Nazi homeland. The versatility and reliability of these craft in rivers, lakes, open ocean, and every imaginable condition proved Higgins' design genius. The boats served everywhere from the windswept coastlines of northern France to the tropical shores of the Pacific Islands, from the frozen Aleutians to the Mediterranean, always performing their mission with remarkable reliability. Yet for all his contributions, Andrew Higgins received less recognition during his lifetime than his achievements merited. While generals and admirals filled history books and had battleships named after them, the boat builder from Nebraska who made their strategies possible remained largely unknown outside military circles. In New Orleans, where his factories had employed thousands and turned the city into a crucial arsenal of democracy, the social elite dismissed him as crude and uncultured. His vocabulary was famously profane. He drank heavily. He lacked the refined manners expected of gentlemen. He was Irish rather than French Creole. The old money families who controlled New Orleans society wanted nothing to do with this rough outsider who had become impossibly wealthy building boats. When the war ended and military contracts evaporated, Higgins Industries struggled to convert to peacetime production. The company never found its footing in civilian markets. Higgins Industries declared bankruptcy in 1959, 7 years after Andrew Higgins died on August 1, 1952, at age 65. He was buried in Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans. At the time of his death, he held 18 patents, most for amphibious landing craft and related innovations. He had received an honorary Doctor of Law degree from Creighton University in 1943, an honor that must have meant much to the young man who had been expelled before completing high school. But the story of the Higgins boat and its impact was never truly forgotten by those who mattered most. Veterans who had charged off those ramps onto hostile beaches never forgot. The men who had been given a fighting chance to survive an amphibious assault because they could get off the boat quickly instead of climbing over the sides under fire, they remembered. They told their children and grandchildren about the boat that saved their lives. Military historians who understood that Allied strategy in both theatres of war depended entirely on the availability of thousands of reliable landing craft preserved the record and kept Higgins' name alive in professional circles. In the late 1990s, popular interest in World War II surged with a new generation seeking to understand the sacrifices of their grandparents. Stephen Ambrose published D-Day, June 6, 1944, The Climactic Battle of World War II in 1994, a comprehensive account that emphasized the role of landing craft. Steven Spielberg released Saving Private Ryan in 1998 with its harrowing opening sequence showing soldiers struggling off a Higgins boat onto Omaha Beach under murderous German fire. The 20-minute sequence burned into public consciousness and raised questions among viewers who had never thought about the mechanics of amphibious assault. Who built those boats? How did they work? Why were they so important? Jerry Strahan published Andrew Jackson Higgins and the Boats That Won World War II in 1998, providing the first comprehensive account of Higgins' achievements and bringing him back into public awareness. The National World War II Museum opened in New Orleans in 2000, appropriately located in the city where Higgins Industries had operated. The museum's founding was championed by historian Stephen Ambrose, specifically to honor the Americans who sacrificed in Neek. The war, including industrial workers like those at Higgins Industries who had worked long hours under tremendous pressure to provide the tools of victory. In May 2019, Andrew Higgins was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, finally receiving national recognition as an innovator on par with Thomas Edison and the Wright brothers. To mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day, The National Inventors Hall of Fame Museum installed a fully restored Higgins boat in the courtyard at the United States Patent and Trademark Office headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia. Visitors could climb aboard and experience firsthand the cramped conditions, the vulnerability of the plywood sides, and gain some small appreciation for the courage it took to ride one of these boats toward an enemy-held beach with machine guns firing and artillery shells exploding in the water around you. Today, visitors to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans can see a replica Higgins boat built in the 1990s using original specifications from Higgins Industries. The boat sits in the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion on Andrew Higgins Drive, a street finally named in his honor. Original Higgins boats survive in museums around the world, carefully preserved as artifacts of the war that shaped the modern world. One is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington. Another is being restored at the Mazie Battery site in Normandy, where it will stand as a permanent reminder of the men who came ashore there. A few original boats have been painstakingly restored to working condition and participate in commemorative events, still capable of performing their original mission 8 decades after they were built. In July 2018, an intact 1942 LCVP was discovered in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta in California, where it had apparently been abandoned after the war. Having sat in brackish water for at least 40 years, the hull remained perfectly sound, testament to the quality of Higgins' construction and the durability of his design. The boat now operates under its own power with the original Chrysler Crown Marine engine and unmodified transmission. All original features, including gauges, fire extinguisher, boat horn, and Bureau of Ships identification number, remain in working order. It serves as a living piece of history, one of the last fully functional examples of the craft that changed the world. The lesson of Andrew Higgins resonates far beyond World War II. His story proves that innovation often comes from unexpected places. A high school dropout from Nebraska solved a problem that had stumped the finest naval architects and military planners in the country. He did it by applying practical problem-solving skills developed while navigating Louisiana bayous, combined with a willingness to adopt good ideas regardless of their source. When shown the Japanese ramp design, Higgins didn't let pride or nationalism prevent him from recognizing a superior solution. He simply incorporated it into his boat and made it work. The story also demonstrates the crucial role of American industrial capacity in determining the outcome of World War II. While battles are fought by soldiers displaying courage and skill, wars between modern industrial nations are ultimately decided by economic production. The United States possessed the industrial capacity to produce not just 23,000 landing craft, but also thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, millions of vehicles, and unfathomable quantities of ammunition, food, medicine, and supplies. This productive capacity overwhelmed the Axis powers. Germany and Japan simply could not match American industrial output, no matter how skilled their soldiers or brilliant their tactics. But that capacity needed to be harnessed and directed by people like Andrew Higgins, who could see problems clearly, devise solutions quickly, and scale production efficiently without sacrificing quality. It needed workers willing to labor long hours under pressure, understanding that their work directly impacted the outcome of battles being fought thousands of miles away. It needed a society that, despite its many flaws and prejudices, could mobilize diverse populations toward common purpose. The integrated workforce at Higgins Industries, revolutionary for its time and place, demonstrated that American strength came from using all available talent regardless of race, gender, age, or physical limitations. The Allied victory in World War II preserved democratic civilization and prevented totalitarian regimes from dominating the globe. That victory depended on countless factors working in concert. Diplomatic skill that held the alliance together despite deep political and ideological differences between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union. Military courage displayed by millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen who faced death repeatedly. Scientific advancement that produced radar, the atomic bomb, code-breaking machines, and countless other innovations. Strategic genius that planned operations like D-Day and coordinated forces across multiple theaters, and industrial capacity that provided the weapons, vehicles, ships, aircraft, and supplies without which all the courage and planning would have been futile. Andrew Higgins sits at the intersection of innovation and production, the place where clever ideas become reality in quantities that change history. His simple modification, a ramp at the front of a landing craft, changed the fundamental calculus of amphibious warfare and made possible operations that would otherwise have been impossible or prohibitively costly. 150,000 soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. They came ashore to liberate a continent and defeat an evil that threatened all humanity. Behind them stood not just generals and admirals planning the operation, but inventors and industrialists, workers and engineers who provided the tools that made victory possible. Andrew Jackson Higgins, with his crude language and relentless determination, his genius for practical problem-solving, his willingness to hire anyone who could do the work regardless of social prejudice, his stubborn refusal to accept the word impossible, stands among the essential contributors to Allied victory. The boat builder from Nebraska who learned his craft in Louisiana bayous became, in Eisenhower's words, the man who won the war for us. His simple innovation opened the door to victory in the largest war ever fought. It gave soldiers a fighting chance on the most dangerous day of their lives. It made possible the liberation of Europe and the defeat of tyranny. One boat builder's improvised ramp landed 150,000 soldiers on D-Day and through them changed the world forever.